Theodore Swinton. And that would be Memphis in 1968. It was raining, which we're all very familiar with here. And two of the 1,300 garbage workers that worked with the city of Memphis were crushed when the garbage truck got It stayed raining. The next day, all of the African-American workers who worked on the trucks were sent home without pay because it was raining. How could we work? And all of the white foremen remained at work and received a day's pay. And with these two incidents, the workers decided we've got to do something. We've got to do something to manage our condition. So they went to the mayor and they said, "We would like to have a union. We'd like to have a wage increase. We'd like to have overtime pay. We'd like to have promotions based on merit." Now, if you look at the working conditions of this group of people, at the time in 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. They were paid $1.70 an hour. Almost 40% of the unit was on either welfare or food stamps because they couldn't make enough money working to support their families. They had no vacation. They had no health care. They had little in terms of other benefits. They had no place to shower when they got done with work, and no place to eat lunch when they took a break in the middle of the day. And they needed to do something. So a couple weeks later, a strike started of the 1,300 garbage workers. The motto of the strikers was, "I am a man." Not because they were sexist, but because the workforce was all male. And as you know, Dr. King spoke to these workers the night before he was shot. He explained what he felt their slogan meant. And he said that we are saying that we are determined to be men. We're determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children and that we don't have to live like we're forced to live. And while Dr. King was not a lawyer, he took a stab at giving a legal justification for what the strikers were doing. And he said that all we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper. Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of the press. Somewhere I read of the greatness of America is the right to protest for what's right. Now, Dr. King was shot the next day. And as a result of the assassination, President Johnson sent the Undersecretary of Labor to Memphis to mediate the strike. 2 weeks later, they reached a settlement, and a few months down the road, the strikers received a wage increase. They received some overtime pay. They received recognition for their union. But that was a terrible cause. If you look at the issues in that strike of garbage workers in Memphis, and you look at the institution of collective bargaining and why we have it, you can see the same types of themes. One reason why we have collective bargaining is because it's really hard for one employee, or even two employees, or even 100 employees to stand up to a giant corporation or a giant entity on the other side. It would be impossible for one garbage man to stand up to the entrenched power structure of Memphis. And similarly, since the days of our initial labor laws, our country has recognized that employees have to be able to band together in order to stand up to their employers. And so one of the interests that collective bargaining protects is the interest in a fair distribution of wealth in a democratic society. But there are other interests, too, that are just as important. A second interest that collective bargaining protects is the right to participate in the decisions that affect your life economically. As a country, we say that people should be engaged politically. They should be knowledgeable about public affairs. They should vote. They should participate in civic activities. And it would be strange, very strange, if we said the minute you go into the door of your workplace, you're supposed to give up your break and whatever the boss says goes. But in an economy without collective bargaining, that's what you have. Because well, you may have an enlightened boss here or an enlightened boss there, or even a whole pool of enlightened bosses. There will be a lot of bosses who say, what I say goes, and I don't want to hear any dissent from the people that I'm paying to work for. Now, the third interest that's protected by collective bargaining is something that we work on, and that's the right to better working conditions. A job that's safer, a job that where you have some protection against the arbitrary decisions of your foreman, a job where if there's a layoff, they can't just lay off who they like, but they have to have some system for laying people off. And that's a sort of a key element of the value of collective bargaining as well. And I like to summarize it by saying that collective bargaining is part of the checks and balances of our economic system. It makes sure that everybody gets a say in how decisions that relate to their terms and conditions of employment and their income are made. And it makes sure that everybody gets a say in the type of economic system we have. With a global economy, with a dynamic market economy, things change, and they change fast. And the change can have dramatic consequences for a town, for a family, for a state, for a whole sector of the economy. And it's true, one thing that collective bargaining does is it slows down the pace of change. Because people can put up their hands and say, no, not so fast, we want to talk about this, we want to bargain about this. But that's a good thing, because if change were to be permitted to be untrammeled, whole towns, sectors of the economy, et cetera, could be destroyed in the course of a year or 2 years. And that is not something that's consistent with a stable and democratic society. Now, if you look at the pendulum in the private sector collective bargaining was declined dramatically, pretty much during the time I practiced law. I hope you think I'm not responsible. And with the decline in bargaining, if you track things like the distribution of income or the distribution of wealth, it's gotten increasingly skewed. So today, the top 1% of the population brings home 25% of the income of the whole country. And the top 1% of the population has 40% of the wealth. And I think that that is fundamentally inconsistent with the founding principles of our country. The founding principle of our country is that nobody's born on third base. Everybody's born at home plate. And everybody gets where they get on their own merit, through their own ingenuity and effort. And a country where just a few people control most of the income and wealth is not a country where people can move up the economic scale through their own ingenuity and effort. A lot of people would say, well, it's international competition. We've got to be flexible. We've got to be able to change quickly in order to keep up with the Japanese or the Germans or the Koreans or the Chinese or who's ever next, Chad or Uzbekistan. But it's really not, because if you track our national productivity has done great in the last 2 decades. It's up 62%. We're a lot wealthier, but the wealth of the people in the middle, that has stayed constant. People tread water in the middle. Most all of the benefits have gone to people in the top 1%, the top 2%, the top 5% of the population. So, does what I'm saying about the private sector, does it apply to the public sector? And the answer is, if you look at the public sector, the answer is squarely yes. In fact, if you look at the inflation-adjusted wages of public employees since 1990, they've actually gone up less than the inflation-adjusted wages of private sector employees. It's 0.6% a year for public employees, 0.7% a year for private employees. If you look at total compensation, pension and health benefits, it's about the same. It's about 0.9% a year in the last 20 years. If you look at high school educated workers in the private sector, their wages and benefits have gone up a little faster. But if you look at college educated workers, and we tell everybody they need to go to college. The wages and benefits of college-educated workers in the private sector have gone up twice as fast as the wages and benefits of college-educated workers in the public sector. If you listen to the talk shows, you might get the impression that teachers and other public workers are paid a lot more than the taxpayers that are supporting them. But in the main, what you hear on the talk shows is not an apples-to-apples comparison. It's an apples-to-oranges comparison. Because if you compare people of comparable education and experience, you will find that public sector workers lag behind their counterparts with college degrees and comparable experience in the private sector. And different studies calculate people lag different ways, different studies take into account different benefits, but it's anywhere from 10% behind to 5% behind. And so if one of your concerns as a participant in an egalitarian democratic society is that the distribution of wealth be fair, then you should support collective bargaining in the public sector for the same reason that you support it in the private sector. And if you believe that if you believe that collective bargaining gives people the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, and that it results in better working conditions, it does the same thing in the public sector as it does in the private sector. So, you will not be surprised to know that I think that the policy case for collective bargaining in the public sector is a strong one. How do you change that into a legal argument? And it's interesting, because if you look around the world, there's pretty widespread acknowledgement that people in the public sector should have the same rights as people in the private sector. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, promulgated by the United Nations, doesn't differentiate between the private and the public sector. The conventions of the International Labour Organization, they don't differentiate. The Charter of Canada very simply talks about freedom of association, and according to the Canadian Supreme Court, that charter does not distinguish between the freedom of association that people have to collectively bargain in the public sector versus what they have to bargain in the private sector. And, you know, if you listen to Marty talk about pensions, this year you have these rights, next year you have different rights. It's very similar to what we used to have before we had collective bargaining, and that is patronage. And when the Democrats came in, all the Democrats would get fired, and you bring in the Democrats from the ground up. When the Republicans came in, it was the opposite. In Illinois, for example, we did litigation when a Republican Secretary of State came in, fired everybody, hired Republicans instead to work for the Secretary of State. And the Seventh Circuit held that that was illegal retaliation against workers for the exercise of their political rights. So how would you take that concept of preventing these swings back and forth, can't be good for running the government? How would you take that concept and translate that into what we see today? And the way that we look at it, state of Wisconsin, for example, I think the governor still has the power to make a contract with a law firm to purchase the labor of that law firm. Has the ability to make a contract with a private contractor to come and pick up the garbage instead of having a public employee do that. Probably has the right to make a contract with a personal services contract with an individual. Come work for me and I'll pay you. And if they can make all of those types of contracts in the state, can it be constitutionally correct to say you can't make a contract with someone just because they want to associate with their colleagues in the workplace? I think that's a denial of the equal protection of the law. Because what you're saying is that if I'm a law firm and I get a contract, but I'm doing the social work services and I want to have a contract, I can't have that same contract. And indeed, the United States Supreme Court, in a case dealing with the village of Northland, has realized that, has acknowledged the principle that contractors and employees have the same basic constitutional right to be protected from retaliation based on their political affiliation. Well, how about their right to associate with their colleagues in the former union will be the same principle. And so we think that legally, one thing that would stop the state from getting rid of collective bargaining for its public employees might be a combination of the freedom of association under the First Amendment as applied to the states through the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And basically what that argument would say is, okay, if the state says we don't contract with anyone, we're not going to have contracts with a law firm, we're not going to have contracts with individuals for services, we're not going to have contracts with contractors for services, that might be okay. But so long as the state says there are some groups that we can sign contracts with, they can't say, well, there are other groups that we can't sign contracts with, and the only reason that we can't is based upon the fact that they formed a union. Now, so at the bottom, I think one thing that we should all think about, in addition to the sanitation workers in Memphis, is it can't be good. It can't be a good way to run a railroad to change the rules every 4 years or 8 years. And so we got to figure out a way to come to a greater consensus on this topic. And the only way that we can come to a consensus is a system that recognizes the legitimate interest of employees and the legitimate interest of employers. And collective bargaining is something that has always done that and has served the country very well in many countries. And that's why we think that the state can't stop collective bargaining for its employees.
Thank you. And what a wonderful segue to the concept